Following the failure of the Constellation-class frigate program, the U.S. Navy is clearly at a crossroads. It must decide whether to pursue a future fleet of reliable frigates, capable of taking over lower intensity missions from destroyers. It must weigh this course of action against the risk of another shipbuilding failure and wasteful spending. It is now clear what path the U.S. Navy has chosen. The service will pursue a new frigate design based on the U.S. Coast Guard's Legend-class National Security Cutter. This ship is significantly smaller than the cancelled Constellation-class frigate. This move appears to be closer to the model of an affordable class of ships that can be mass-produced. While sensible, the decision reflects a Navy struggling to reconcile its force requirements with the realities of cost control, constrained shipbuilding capacity, and a desire to rein in ambition. The new FFX frigate, derived from an existing American hull, represents both a pragmatic reset and a test. It is a test of whether the service has learned from decades of acquisition failures. The recently cancelled Constellation-class was conceived as the Navy's answer to the troubled littoral combat ship program. By selecting a largely off-the-shelf European design, the Franco-Italian FREM, the Navy hoped to acquire a capable, affordable, and timely frigate with minimal development risk. Instead, the Constellation became a case study in what happens when requirements creep overwhelms good intentions. Over 5 years, the American design diverged so far from its parent hull that commonality dropped to roughly 15%. Costs ballooned, construction lagged badly, and by 2025, the lead ship was only around 10% complete, with delivery slipping to 2029. At nearly 80% of the cost of a destroyer, but offering only a fraction of its capability, the Constellation no longer made strategic or financial sense. However, its cancellation left the Navy with a glaring gap in its future force composition. That gap is real and pressing. The Navy remains heavily dependent on the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers to handle most missions. At the same time, the Ticonderoga-class cruisers are approaching retirement, and the littoral combat ships have failed to mature into the flexible contributors they were promised to be. In this context, the absence of a viable frigate is arguably a structural weakness. Without frigates, the Navy risks overworking its destroyer fleet and reducing overall readiness. Given these requirements, the Navy's decision to base its new FFX frigate on the Legend-class National Security Cutter is understandable, and perhaps even sound. The Legend-class is not a theoretical design. 10 cutters have already been built and commissioned between 2008 and 2024 for the U.S. Coast Guard, giving the platform a long and well-documented operational history. Designed for blue water operations, it has proven endurance with a range of around 12,000 nautical miles and the ability to sustain 90-day deployments. Built to 90% military standards, it incorporates features often absent from standard Coast Guard patrol vessels. These include robust damage control, degaussing to reduce magnetic signatures, a reduced radar cross-section, and survivability built to U.S. Navy standards. While the Coast Guard cutter is optimized for a lower threat environment, the underlying design provides a solid foundation for further navalization. At roughly 418 feet in length, and with a displacement of about 4,700 tons, the Legend-class is significantly smaller than the roughly 7,300-ton Constellation design. This reduction in size is not a weakness. It is a recognition of what a frigate is supposed to be and what it is not. A frigate is not a miniature destroyer. Frigates are meant to take on day-to-day missions, operate in groups, and focus on niche roles like anti-submarine warfare. They free up larger combatants for the most demanding missions, especially area air defense. Frigates should be affordable, more numerous, and crucially, a more expendable combatant. Their value lies in presence, persistence, and numbers, rather than in raw firepower or sensor coverage. By choosing a smaller hull with modest armament, the Navy is implicitly accepting that not every ship needs to carry a full suite of high-end capabilities and powerful air defense radar. In theory, this allows the fleet to grow in a more balanced and sustainable way, rather than concentrating combat power in a small number of expensive and overstretched warships. In its current Coast Guard configuration, the Legend-class is modestly armed. It carries a 57mm main gun a phalanx close-in weapon system, electronic warfare equipment, decoys, and crew-served weapons. It lacks a vertical launch system, VLS, and the layered air defense that would define a true modern frigate. However, space, weight, and power margins were deliberately built into the ship. Huntington Ingalls Industries has spent more than a decade developing frigate variants that add anti-ship missiles, torpedoes, and better sensors. This prior design work reduces technical risk, at least compared to starting completely from a clean sheet. The Navy's conceptual illustration of the FFX frigate suggests a cautious approach. We have some details about its intended armament. The ship will retain the Mark 100 10-57mm main gun, the U.S. Navy's adaptation of the Swedish Bofors naval automatic gun. Somewhat surprisingly, the U.S. Navy has reportedly confirmed to defense media that the first flight of the FFX will not include a built-in vertical launching system. This dispels the uncertainty regarding the VLS location and explains why it was not present in the initial renderings of the FFX. However, the U.S. Navy also stated that, much like the Arleigh Burke destroyer program, they expect to upgrade the FFX over time through successive flights. This likely means that a Mark 41 VLS could be installed on future flights, if actual operations and combat experience deem it worthwhile. Previous frigate designs, based on the Legend class by Huntington Ingalls, showed 12 VLS cells positioned just behind the main gun for evolved sea-sparing medium-range missiles. The Navy also stated that minimal design changes will be incorporated into the first flight so they can get holes into the water as soon as possible. This suggests that the VLS was omitted, at least initially, to minimize development risk and expedite procurement. Indeed, adding a VLS to such a vessel is no easy task. It is not immediately obvious where a vertical launch system should be installed, especially if the ship retains its main gun. The VLS cannot be placed too far forward on the bow, due to hull depth requirements. Therefore, it would have to be placed in the narrow area between the bridge and the 57mm gun.
Aegis engage on designated target.
This would require rearranging existing structures, which raises the risk of design errors and delays. The Navy must be wary of repeating the same mistakes as the Constellation-class regarding design overreach. So it makes sense to exclude the VLS for now. Furthermore, leveraging the longer range air defense enabled by a VLS such as SM-2 and SM-6 missiles, would require powerful air search radars. Ideally, the ship would need multiple air defense radars in different bandwidths to handle different jobs. You would want an S-band radar for long-range volume search, and an X-band radar for target illumination and fire control at the very least. Given the desire for the latest technology, that would mean active electronically scanned array, AESA, radars instead of older passive phased arrays. But all of these systems consume significant power and space, and are likely to cause stability issues on a small ship. A warship based on the smaller Legend-class cutter may not be able, or at least not suitable, to incorporate all these advanced radar systems. If that is the case, it would reduce the effectiveness of a vertical launching system and its more advanced air defense missiles. There is also no need to put Tomahawk missiles on these frigates, given that land attack missions can be assigned to larger destroyers and cruisers, eliminating another reason for a VLS. However, the lack of a VLS does substantially reduce the frigate's air defense capability. This would require the protection of more capable air defense warships armed with VLS, such as destroyers, at least when operating in heavily contested waters. Alternatively, the frigates could operate only in rear areas or lightly contested waters, reducing the need for heavy defensive capabilities. The FFX will feature a modest suite of point defense weapons. A defensive weapon not found on the original cutter is a Mark 49 launcher for the Rolling Airframe Missile, RAM, for close-range defense. This is positioned just forward of the helipad. There are unspecified countermeasures mentioned by the Navy, likely electronic warfare suites and chaff or flare decoy launchers to confuse incoming weapon guidance systems. There is also the option of installing modular weapon systems, one of which mentioned by the Navy is a counter-drone system. We see in the illustration that a prominent raised platform has been added to the lower front of the forward superstructure. This seems likely to be used in the future as a mount for some type of point defense weapon. This could be, for example, a phalanx CIWS in a super firing position over the main gun. At the stern of the ship, The drawings show two slanted launchers for anti-ship cruise missiles. These are very likely the Naval Strike Missile, NSM, which the Navy is integrating across its fleet. There appears to be room for up to 16 Naval Strike Missiles and 4 quad launchers. Although if that were the case, there would not be room for much else. The Naval Strike Missile is a significant upgrade over the older Harpoon anti-ship missiles found on some U.S. warships. In terms of electronic systems, it seems highly unlikely that the FFX will operate a radar system on the same power level as the Constellation-class frigate. It is also unlikely to operate the full Aegis combat system, especially if air defense is not a key mission. The power generation and cooling requirements would likely be too great. The FFX will likely receive a more capable medium-range radar than the one currently found on the Coast Guard cutter. The U.S. Navy convention during the Cold War was to assign frigates to anti-submarine warfare, ASW. If this is the role of the FFX, then priority will be given to torpedoes, towed array sonar, potentially a variable depth sonar, and an anti-submarine helicopter. Given that the Legend-class cutter already has a helipad, a hangar, and a tactical air navigation system, and we see a helipad in the drawing, it is virtually certain the FFX will deploy at least one helicopter. The elephant in the room is, of course, the prognosis of the program. The U.S. Navy has a poor record of building new warship classes over the past 2 decades. However, the Navy insists it has learned its lesson. Navy leadership has emphasized that requirements will be locked down before construction begins, and that change orders will be tightly controlled. The acquisition strategy is built around a lead shipyard, followed by competitive construction at multiple yards, with an emphasis on expanding the domestic industrial base. On paper, this approach addresses many of the structural problems that plagued previous naval shipbuilding programs. Yet, skepticism is warranted. The Navy's recent shipbuilding history is littered with well-intentioned reforms that failed in practice. The Zumwalt-class destroyers were meant to revolutionize naval warfare, only to be truncated at 3 ships after costs spiraled out of control. The Littoral Combat Ship program promised modularity and affordability, but delivered underarmed vessels with persistent mechanical issues and limited combat relevance. The Constellation-class itself was supposed to be the antidote to these failures, and instead became the latest example of design overreach. Against this record, the FFX frigate must be judged not by its conception, but by its execution. The decision to use a smaller, proven hull is sound in principle. It aligns with the strategic role frigates are meant to play and acknowledges the limits of the Navy's acquisition capacity. The decision to omit a vertical launch system is debatable, but the rationale of minimizing design changes and delivery risk is commendable. It shows a Navy that has learned from its mistakes. However, discipline will be everything. If the service attempts to transform the Legend-based design into something beyond an affordable frigate, the result could be another expensive disappointment. There is also the broader question of survivability and expectations. A frigate based on the Legend class will not be optimized for high-intensity combat against peer adversaries. That is acceptable, provided the Navy is honest about how it intends to use these ships. Frigates should not be treated as substitutes for destroyers in dangerous environments. They should be employed where their endurance, numbers, and moderate combat power offer the greatest return on investment. Accepting this trade-off is essential to avoiding the trap that sank the Constellation. Ultimately, the new FFX frigate represents a crossroads. It could signal a return to realism in U.S. naval shipbuilding, where roles, costs, and capabilities align with strategic needs. Or it could become another chapter in a long story of overreach and disappointment. The choice to build on the Legend-class Coast Guard cutter is a rational starting point. Whether it leads to success will depend less on the ship itself than on the Navy's ability to resist its own worst instincts. If the service can truly deliver a simpler, smaller, and more affordable frigate by 2028, it will have taken a meaningful step toward restoring balance in the surface fleet. If not, the FFX risks becoming yet another symbol of an institution that knows what it needs, but cannot quite bring itself to build it.